Good morning. How is everyone doing? Are we almost ready? Good. So I think we'll get started just so we can keep on time here. I'm Olivia Silvestro. I think I met most of you at the orientation when we had our orientation session. And you'll learn a little bit more about me today in terms of what I'm interested in food security and the research that I do. And then we're going to collectively have a dialogue about the modes of production of our food and how that relates to food security. So to give you a small introduction, why am I interested in this topic? Well, ever since I was small, I used to have a huge garden in our backyard. I gardened with my grandmother ever since I was around 2 or 3 years old. I used to harvest wild mushrooms with my dad in this kind of rural area of Alberta, Canada. So this is where I'm from. You can see the red pin there in Calgary. And this is the beautiful landscape that is about 45 minutes from my house. So the environment has been close to me. Gardening and harvesting food has been close to me my whole life. So that's kind of what brought me to this topic. Sustainability has also been close to my heart because you can see kind of the pine trees there, and this is by the Rocky Mountains. But if you go maybe 8 to 10 hours north by car, you will reach the boreal forest of Alberta. And unfortunately, most of my academic career, that has been the site of the tar or the oil sand extraction. So you can see the forests at the back of Alberta, as they were, and all of that open pit mine area for the tar or the oil sands was boreal forest, and that was clear cut. So these issues, as I said, have been close to me. They've been close to me in my province, and I've been aware of them my whole life, and then this kind of sustainable development issue my whole academic career. These interests brought me to Costa Rica almost 12 years ago now, and I did my master's degree at the University of Costa Rica, and I worked in national parks in Costa Rica. So in the map where the San Jose dot is, I worked in 2 different national parks. And if you have taken any conservation classes, if you haven't, I'm going to tell you the answer, but you may know that a national park is created and humans are generally excluded from that natural area. So I was interested in finding out, were there any traditional foods that humans used before they were excluded from these parks? So that was my master's research, and it brought me to do another research project for my PhD in this green area, which is Costa Rica's largest national park. It's called La Amistad International Park, shared with Panama. And the black line that covers kind of that Talamanca region in the black box is the traditional Bribri and Quebecer indigenous territory. So actually even the park is part of that territory. So some colleagues of mine, including an indigenous scholar from the University of Costa Rica, did a project asking whether the creation of this park permitted or inhibited access to these traditional foods for indigenous people in Costa Rica. So you can see this kind of line around food security and food access that I started to develop. This is that area, and we're going to use this case today to talk a little bit about food security. And here is one of those traditional foods. This is a this is actually in the green leaf. You'll see palm flowers, wild palm. And you actually eat the inflorescence or the flower. And what I'm holding in my hand, that spig, is really spiky, but that's where you get the palm flower out, and you can roast it. So there's lots of really interesting foods out there that are part of people's food security that maybe aren't on our radars. And I've continued this project since my PhD, which was years back. And now we're bringing together, this project is kind of morphed into a project where we're bringing together indigenous communities, and this was just a month ago. We brought together some leaders from Malaysia to meet with leaders from Costa Rica to discuss some of these issues around access and food security. And I think that that's a really strong point in terms of research, not only learning about it in the classroom and working with these communities, but also bringing the communities together to talk about plans for collective action. And then we have the garden. So this is the most recent food security effort of mine and colleagues here at UPeace. And some of you were at our garden meeting, and we do work with our students as well as educational workshops for kids. So in terms of sustainable development goals, you can see that my work focuses a lot on number 2, the topic of today's lecture: ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. So that's a lot for an SDG. We have lots of SDGs, but that's a lot together. And in the previous goals, we didn't have food security and agriculture together. So some of us might see those clear links between food security and sustainable agriculture, and others of us may not be as familiar. So that's what I want us to talk about today. So if you learn one or two things from this class, I want us to remember from your reading the 4 dimensions of food security, and then I want us to make that link just as they do in the SDGs between the food security, but actually the first steps, the way we produce our food. We can talk about a lot of other things related to food security in your year at UPeace, and feel free to talk with me anytime. But today I want to start kind of at the roots and look at the links between food security and sustainable agriculture. So we'll start with the definition, and then I've got 2 cases to work through with us, with you guys today. And feel free also, I gave my introduction, feel free to just raise your hand if something wasn't clear, or if as I'm going through the examples you have a question, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So this is just the basic definition. There's 4 pillars or 4 dimensions of food security. And these will be important after we look at our 2 examples. So I just want us to remember what these 4 pillars are, and then at the end we will come back to them. The definition is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. Then we have these 4 dimensions starting on your right. In red, physical availability, that's just the supply side of food. So that's how much food there is available. The next one is a little more complicated, economic and physical access. So sometimes it doesn't matter how much food exists in a supermarket or a store or a restaurant or what have you, but we may or may not have access to that based on our economic status, social status, cultural status. We can have access to food either if we grow it ourselves, if we have land to grow it. We might have access because we have the means to procure that or purchase it. And we can also have access if we have trading, like we might share food. We don't necessarily need the economic capital to access food. And then we have in yellow food utilization. So that's just quality of food. That's a measure of quality. So how our body uses the nutrients that we get. That starts to tell us a little bit more, not about quantity of nutrition, but the quality of the food we eat. And then the 4th, which is really important for sustainability, is stability over time. So we can be food secure for a short period of time. We can be food secure over a long period of time, and this stability measure is important because we can't just think about food security in a short period. We need to be thinking in a prolonged way. So now that we have that definition in our head and we can think about those dimensions, we'll come back to those. But as I said, we're going to think about food security going back to the roots and looking at the modes of production. So we looked at industrial. So there's 2 examples of modes of production that I want us to remember today, which is the industrial mode of food production and the agroecological. And we're going to define those, but maybe someone can help us with that definition. Does anyone know the difference between industrial, or guess, or speculate, educated guess, between industrial or agroecological? We have a volunteer way at the back. What's your name again? Patricia.
So basically, industrial agriculture is making a lot of, and with a certain amount of resources, and making a profit out of it, versus agriculture is being ecological and conscious about your surroundings and your ambience and cultivating that way as a whole ecology system, basically.
Thank you, Patricia. She saved me some work of remembering the definitions. For sure, industrial is thinking about production and yields for profit. Remember, you can have profit from this model as well. They're both profitable, but it's just the way we think about production. So the main difference, as Patricia said, is industrial is thinking about yields. We want to maximize our yields through maximum efficiency. And that really actually requires us to think about producing one or few things. So we're actually reducing our system to the simplest parts. It's like modes of production. We're simplifying to produce. We have maybe 1 or 2 goals in that. Agroecological really circles around the word ecological, as Patricia said. It's a whole ecological system. So we're thinking about complexity in the system. We're thinking about the natural ecological links that occur in the environment, and we're maintaining those in agriculture. So we're not thinking of just producing for maximum yield and maximum profits. We actually can get a nice yield and profit from agroecological, but we're not going to do it in this simplistic mass production type of way. So we'll go back to those. I'm going to give you examples because it's not necessarily so clear just through the definitions. But before I give you those examples, I want you to remember that the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN says that sustainable agriculture must nurture healthy ecosystems and support the sustainable management of land, water, and natural resources while ensuring food security. So just reading this, when I say nurture healthy ecosystems, we're already thinking about the ecosystem in sustainable agriculture. So when we go through two examples, one of industrial and one of agroecological, I want you to think about which fits better with the UN definition of sustainable agriculture. And the UN also says that to be sustainable, we must meet the needs of future generations for its products and services while ensuring profitability, environmental health, and social and economic equity. So think about that too when we look at the two different models. Okay. I think I need to point at that. Right. So just to have the words there for you, industrial is emphasis on production, reduced system complexity, and agroecological. We're applying all those principles from regular ecological systems into agriculture. So this picture is a picture from something similar to your video about pineapple production. This is bananas, and I think it's wheat or canola on the bottom. I think it's from Canada, the picture. But right away, if you look at this picture, what comes to mind? Maybe just throw out some words from what you feel when you see that image. Mass production, what else? Pesticides, what else? Inputs? Anything else? Efficiency? Contamination? Pollution? Sorry? Future cancer. Okay, so a lot around inputs and the impacts of those inputs, and then yield, so mass production, definitely. And then I just want us to focus on this, fight the blight. This is a type of crop pest, and really when we look at not only the way the food is being produced, but the language that we're using for our environment is strong language. We're not talking about nurturing the environment and the complexity of ecological systems. We're talking about fighting something that exists in the ecosystem for yields. So it's a real different way of thinking about our surroundings. This is a picture from that map where I showed you, the Bribri Indigenous Territory, close to that green park we looked at. This is an example of an agroecological system. What comes to mind when you see this picture? Organic food? Harmony? Healthy? Insects? Variation? Self-production? Sustainability? Do you think low yields when you see that? Does that what, yeah, low yields? Can you define yield? Yes, I can. Okay, so let's just go first, before I define yield, we'll go and talk about the words that came. So diversity, harmony, sustainability, there was another one. Healthy, right. And then we talked about potentially low yields. Why would you say that this is low yield? Okay, but what in the picture makes you think that it's like that? Could be knowledge from what you've read or seen before, but that picture, what makes you think low yield? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So yeah, older leaves there that we might later cut off and use to compost or to mulch the soil, not just getting rid of anything that's not useful. So thinking in terms of production, definitely. And then in terms of yield would be output that you get out of production. That's what it would be, the output you get of production. So the point of putting this picture here is to show you that actually this example, all of these foods that are harvested here are found within this system. You can see something slightly different. It may indicate low yields, or on the short term. On the long term, maybe not. And actually, we can talk about that later, about the data on that. But we also have to remember that we may have, someone over here said, less inputs. We may have to buy less inputs if we're relying on natural things in the ecosystem to maintain this system. So there's some questions about that, and there are some interesting studies. Yeah. What is picture? That's an armadillo. It's a wild armadillo that would have, you could hunt it within that system because you're not applying toxic pesticides that would deter those animals or would poison those animals. So they would live in the forest but also come down into the crops. So after looking at those two pictures, let's look a little more into depth into the industrial model. And you had one example of the industrial model in your video with pineapple production. We have learned or will learn that Costa Rica consumes more agrochemicals per hectare than any country in the world. It's not limited to Costa Rica, however. 1/6 of all the agrochemicals used are in the US as well. So Costa Rica is more per hectare, but we have a lot in other countries as well. But just thinking about pineapple, and I took these data that I'm going to give you from different national studies. So this is the one institute, Business Institute in Costa Rica, and then I have some from the national universities. But we know now, right now, that Costa Rica is the #1 producer of pineapple. It's Costa Rica's main export, agricultural export, and there are many people employed directly or indirectly in the pineapple industry. So data from the National University, the Institute for Toxic Substances, says that we're using close to 20 kilos per hectare of pesticides in Costa Rica for pineapple. But this is even more for some other crops in other provinces. And in 2010, from the same institute, they documented 146 health cases reported in public health care due to agrochemicals. Did anyone for their food research pineapples? No? Does anyone have a guess or know what pesticides are used on pineapples? Glyphosate could be used as a weed killer, yes, but it's not the main one. But we will talk about glyphosate. Diazinon is used, but still not the main one. Neonicotinoids, no, but I'll give you the answer. But yeah, we'll talk about glyphosate is used, and as well, what's your name, sorry? Julius. What Julius said. But bromacil and paraquat is now the main pesticide because bromacil it's being phased out in Costa Rica. There has been that National Institute here that I showed you from this data produced enough scientific research that was used to inform a decree that that bromacil was outlawed here. But this was only in 2015, so it was only recently. And before then, we were using bromacil and paraquat, which bromacil has been deemed a possible carcinogen and paraquat fatal by inhalation. And we are still using paraquat. So there's been quite a few studies. This one was from 2012. This is in the Caribbean, where the red dot is, where some of the pineapple plantations are. And they found high quantities of pesticides in the water, and then they also did an upstream downstream study and found toxicity to fish, to fish and to plant growth. So toxic to the natural ecosystem. Another pineapple area in the central north of Costa Rica, where that red pin is as well, it's close to the Arenal volcano if you have traveled there or know of it. A community that lives close, that some people may or may not work on the plantations, filed a legal complaint against Anexo in 2017 because they said that pineapple plantations were destroying their aquifer, the wetlands, as well as their cattle industry. So you can see this picture here from 2017, and this is an aerial shot, and on the right-hand side you can see all the lines, kind of this of one crop. So this is an example of monocropping of the pineapple. But the corridors of the green shrubs, if you can kind of see them there, are natural wetlands. So wetlands are important for many ecological functions, as well as they have conservation value, they sequester carbon. But one thing, when we went back and the community made this complaint that it's destroying the groundwater, it's destroying the wetlands because of expansion, as well as what you see here. So in these crops, you can see what happens to the soils because we're just planting one crop. We see a lot of soil erosion. We don't have big trees with big roots in the ground that are protecting that soil. We're basically clear cutting and using that just for one crop. And then you can see if you're aerial spraying pesticides there or if you're spraying it manually, you can see how that would contaminate the water source. But in terms of the cattle, and I think this came up in the video, if I recall, we're thinking of efficiency. We're not thinking of composting some of those dead leaves of banana that you mentioned. When we take these pineapples, we often cut off the crowns. So when there's a whole bunch of crowns that are cut off, we might sell them with the crowns, but if we're processing them, we'll cut them off and leave them in large piles. So you could compost those crowns, and in fact, some of our farmers here will tell us that you can cut the crown off and actually plant it again. That crown will grow roots. So anytime you buy a pineapple, if you'll ever buy one again, maybe an organic one, you'll cut off the top and you could actually sprout that and it'll become a new pineapple. But what happens is they have large piles because they're not thinking about our food waste, and they're not in this type of farming, we're not thinking of that. We just have large piles of food waste of pineapple crowns, and that attracted what was this stable fly. And this is a pest fly that became concentrated in the pineapple waste, and then that started attacking the cattle industry. So local farmers, just small-scale farmers that live close to pineapple plantations, were finding their cows were infested with this fly, and that was decreasing milk production. So that was affecting their economic security and then, in turn, their food security. So another study from the National University, and this is in Spanish, but I'll translate it, found that a lab found that there was 8 times more bromacil in water than they would in Costa Rica, in drinking water, in the Caribbean side, so that first map, than is permitted in the United States. So these are the data that helped to create the decree to outlaw bromacil from Costa Rica. Then we had some good news because of all the negative impacts and data on paraquat. Dole, a large pineapple producer, they announced in 2008 that they were going to discontinue paraquat in all of their agricultural operations. So this was really good news for those of us that care about this topic. Except, remember that pesky fly that was attacking the cattle? Well, the quickest and easiest way to get rid of that fly, because we're not thinking of compost, we're not thinking of replanting, we're not thinking of complexity and sustainability into the future. In industrial, we're thinking of production now and large profits. They found the easiest way to kill that fly was just to douse it in paraquat. So then they made this announcement, but then this is really small writing, but this was an update from Dole in 2012, said that the Costa Rican government requires growers to control the stable fly, so we're not actually going to reduce or eliminate paraquat in Costa Rica because we need it for the fly. So these examples just show you the mentality and way of thinking in an industrial model. But some skeptics might say that, well, over time, things may become more sustainable, and if people are increasing their economic security, they may also increase their food security. So if people are working and earning money from pineapple plantations, then maybe that allows them to diversify their diets. There might be some health impacts, but it may also have positive impacts. So a master's student, just like all of you at the University of Costa Rica, did her thesis on pineapple, and she actually looked at this map. The dark brown counties are the main producers of pineapple. So she looked from year 2000 until 2014 when there was an explosion of pineapple, and she said maybe in the areas with high growth of pineapple, we saw economic growth in the counties. So some of these areas in the north of Costa Rica were actually on the lowest 10 for the development index in Costa Rica. So she measured it from 2000 until 2014, and just look at the part that says IDH. So we have 3 different IDHs. If we look at the top, we can see Upala, which the IDH only goes up by 0.05. So they did go up to 51 from 76, but if you look at the bottom, Los Chiles, it actually only goes up 0.01 or less, and they actually go down in their social Human Development Index. So she found that even though the areas with high pineapple plantations, we didn't actually raise these statistics. So just to go beyond Costa Rica because we may think, oh, is this only an issue in Costa Rica? I gave you this example because we all live here. Yeah.
What do they do with all the food waste, like the
Well, sometimes it's hard to dispose of. Sometimes it's buried. Sometimes it's burned. Sometimes it's left in piles. It all depends on the operation. Yeah. And as I said, in an agroecological model, that would be composted, that would be replanted, stuff like that. So I wanted to go a little bit beyond Costa Rica. And we had a, what was your name, sorry? Yeah.
Red.
Red? You mentioned which pesticide earlier?
I mentioned glyphosate.
Yeah, glyphosate. Yeah, yeah. So this, yes, herbicide or general category pesticide. So glyphosate has got a lot of public attention, so beyond Costa Rica. We do use this other pesticide, glyphosate. Raise your hand who, for in your research for today's class, for how many of you did this pesticide come up, glyphosate or Roundup? Okay, so quite a few of us. And does anyone know what this picture, what news event, just recent news event this picture refers to? Corinne?
He was working as a landscaper and he got cancer from using Roundup
Mm-hmm.
from Monsanto, so he sued Monsanto. It was the first successful case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is Dwayne Johnson, and Dwayne Johnson applied glyphosate, which is the main chemical component in this, which is called Roundup. It's Monsanto now Bayer's product, which is a herbicide, but it's used in all types of agricultural operations. It's also used in landscaping. So he was working as a landscaper at a school, and he said that in one day, he sometimes applied over 500 liters of glyphosate or Roundup on the school grounds. And he sued Monsanto, and there's actually 44 other cases in line that have come down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer. And the case has been that Monsanto hid and didn't disclose the impacts of this herbicide or pesticide to the people that were using it. And not even that, they actually knew about some of the carcinogenic impacts of this and didn't disclose them. So it wasn't just that they didn't disclose that it could be harmful, they knew about it and didn't. And so that's why in this case, Dwayne Johnson was awarded $289 million. The judge ordered that internal documents from Monsanto were revealed, and they showed things that back to 1980, they knew this. The World Health Organization in 2015 deemed glyphosate it was the first time they deemed one of these mainstream pesticides a probable carcinogen, not a possible. But it took us even from 2015 to now, 2018, for some case like this to come out. So this is the United Nations deemed this a first step to a victory for human rights. So let's go to the other model and see what we find. All right, so the agroecological model, and I'll just repeat it, seeks to increase complexity versus industrial farming, which mainly relies on one crop, one or few, a monocrop, to increase productivity in a land area. Can anyone give me an example of an agroecological technique? I gave one, which is composting. Yeah, intercropping, which would be multiple crops instead of just those rows of pineapple. Permaculture, yet working with the ecological processes in the environment to support your farm. What else?
crop rotation?
Crop rotation, what does that do?
It revitalizes the soil. Each crop takes different minerals and nutrients out of the soil.
Exactly. So crop rotation is cool because if you're growing pineapple over and over or any crop in one area, they're depleting the soil of those nutrients. So if you rotate crops, you'll have different nutrient requirements. So first of all, you'll have different nutrients that are being used over time, but you can actually throw in the mix crops that produce in a way, there's a whole scientific process, but they sequester or fix or give the soil things like nitrogen. So you don't even have to put in those inputs, not just the pesticides, because industrial agriculture also relies on synthetic fertilizers, so things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and some of that is mined, then processed, then put in the fields. And think of all the energy that's wasted along the way. When you can just plant a tree from the legume family, which is the bean family, in the soil, and that's not only what we call intercropping, it provides shade, and then it also gives nitrogen to the soil. Yeah.
I was just going to say in that photo you showed of the brie plot, what I would guess they do is, you know, when you have bananas that are ready, you cut the tree down, and they probably just leave the tree
They do,
there.
yeah.
And that's
The tree stays, like that stem, it's actually like the part of the leaves, which we see as a stem, lays on the ground, and then those nutrients go back into the soil. But instead of being a whole bunch of banana stems, like you would have a whole bunch of pineapple waste, you also have insects in the area that if you did get a pest, you would have other natural insects. Like if you had a fly, you could have a bird that eats that fly, because we're creating an ecological environment that ideally isn't toxic to all the other beings around. And so I put a whole bunch of examples, but you gave me quite a few, and that's excellent. And then there's some social examples of agroecology. So the idea of sharing knowledge among farmers, sharing knowledge among generations, so passing on that key knowledge, even saving your seeds. So in an industrial model, companies often have patents over seeds, over some of the modified seeds or some of the, any seeds. There's patents on some seeds, and in others people just buy those seeds. And that requires you to be investing money every time you purchase new material. But if you save your own seeds and you trade them with farmers, that creates solidarity, that creates knowledge sharing, and that also helps you in terms of your economic access. Did I have a question here?
I just wanted to mention aquaculture as well.
Yes, aquaculture as well. Aquaculture would have different successes and challenges as well, because you can have aquaculture in an agroecological model, but you can have an industrial aquaculture where you're just inputting all this animal feed where the fish eat it, and then that's the contamination's going into the ocean. So you'd have to look at what type of aquaculture that is. So going back to this example again from Costa Rica, so we can learn a little bit more of this country, we can look in this area. So the town that I'm showing you the pictures from is that black dot that says Bajo Cuen. It's close to some rivers there, and it's close to the La Amistad International Park. And I just will reiterate, all of that is traditional Bribri territory, even though the state took over some of that for the national park. These are beautiful pictures from Bajo Cuen, so you can see that the forest feeds into the agricultural plots. You have these kind of forests in the backdrop and then plots in the lowland, and you travel often by rivers to get to towns to see people and to different farms. And so going back to this picture, with some research that I did with my colleagues, this is my colleague Sebastiana Segura taking me to one of her plots. We found in 9 hectares of land, so that's not, it's enough, but it's not a lot of land. 12 female farmers and 9 hectares of land, we found over 50 plant and animal species. Not insects or things like that, just any wild meat that would be harvested. Actually, no, that was over 50 just plants. Sorry, the meat was something else. We found over 50 plant species. So those were types of species that people were farming and intercropping, like our colleague said. So you might see some of those trees that produce this type of palm fruit. You might see different species of bananas, not one species of banana. And then you'll have different foods like on your bottom right, which are fiddlehead ferns. Those grow near the borders of the forest, but if someone's plot reaches the forest. And then those orange fruits, I'm trying to remember the name. I only know the Bribri name, but it's not coming to me. You can cook those up and then roast them into patties and eat them. It's a type of a wild food. And maybe in this small picture you can see these are peach palm fruits, plantain, and another green, really spicy, yummy wild food treat. So this is just from this publication. We did some work on different plots. But it's interesting to think that in only 9 hectares, so there's like an area, there's different data, 40%, 50% of the world is cultivated in terms of land. So that's a lot of land. And so if we have a lot of land in industrial farming, that's not a lot of crop species. Another benefit of the agroecological model is we're preserving all of this diversity. And this diversity is not only important for food security, so thinking about what we have access to eat, but it's also important into the future, because as we're dealing with things like climate change, We're dealing with that some crops are being wiped out by temperatures that are too high or too low. Some pests are becoming more prevalent. All of this genetic diversity that we have of all of these wild foods has been important historically and will come to be important into the future. So you might say, well, this is really neat. It can work with these small brie farms, but how are they supposed to produce food for profit? Well, in fact, let me go back to this one. This plot here is actually a farm to supply food to organic bananas to the Gerber Corporation. So a transnational corporation. Who's heard of Gerber? Gerber baby food. So if you have baby cousins or sisters or relatives and they eat organic bananas, it's coming from here. And if you don't believe me, you can go on Amazon and look up Gerber baby food and look at where it says product of Costa Rica. So these farmers are actually producing for profit. They're actually producing within our market food system. I'm not going to go into the social dimensions of this, which we can talk about outside of the class or if there's time for questions. I'm not claiming that the model for producing for Gerber is actually socially just. It's not. What I am trying to say is that they are producing enough food to be selling into the market. So it's not just harvesting wild foods for the household. They're producing food to eat themselves as well as to sell to the market. And going back to that idea of food security, and if we have an agroecological model, how do people relate that to food security? So these are my two colleagues. Sebastiana is in front and Hernan is in the back. And we were harvesting some corn from a traditional plot that was behind the banana plot. And we were talking about food security. And Sebastiana described her farm in many ways, but back in 2013 to me like this. She said, "Here we never go hungry. If there is no meat, we go to the field and harvest heart of palm or any ard. Ard is any type of wild food in Bri, just like our elders taught us." So this quote, it says, if there is no meat. What she means by that, if there's no food. Because when I translated this even from Spanish to English, for at least for her and some Bri people, meat is a big part of the diet. So if it's wild meat or farmed meat. So what she's saying is if there's no good food around, or we didn't have money to purchase food from the market, or we didn't have any chickens that we would have harvested, we can still go out and harvest vegetables like heart of palm or any wild vegetable, just like our elders taught us. And then that reinforces what we were talking about, the sharing of knowledge from generation to generation. Because I think if we think to industrial agriculture, if we went and tried to use out all of these portions of fertilizers and inputs, we would actually have to read a lot of manuals to do that. So we're talking about different types of knowledge. One is not necessarily better or worse than the other, but we can start thinking about one as slightly more exclusionary. So we need to have that training. It's a type of Western scientific knowledge, whereas in agroecology, we're prioritizing all of these cultural knowledges that exist. This was just that picture there. So just thinking about that field, we may have lower yields. I haven't studied the yields in these fields, but the research does show that in the global south or the developing world, there was one study a few years back of 293 comparative farms that in the global south, that agroecological models had more productivity than the industrial, depending on the crop. And then it would be slightly less in the global north. So it really all depends. And as for profits, as I said, you have to look at yields, but you also have to look at what you're spending on inputs. So a lot of the studies out there talk about the profitability, and that industrial agriculture, we need it because we save money, we can drop prices, people can afford more food, but then we have to ask at what cost. So I'm going to close with just this idea that has there been too much emphasis on the industrial model? We have, if you had a chance to read the recommended reading, or if you have it in your library to read later, it's an essay and it doesn't have all of the data that we need, but there's quite a few studies coming out It does give you a brief essay, however, that in 2017, we produced enough food to feed our population of 7.6 billion. So if we're still focusing on this industrial model that we need to produce, remember we have 4 dimensions of food security. We need to work on that dimension of availability, the supply side. We might be missing something because we still have over 800 million people hungry. We have a lot of people in the world undernourished, and we did actually produce enough food. So we want to start rethinking maybe this model of food production due to some of the social, health, and environmental impacts. And then this was an essay written, but also the UN FAO State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World Report in 2017 says something very similar. They reiterate that we are producing enough food to feed the world, and they make this statement, that we urgently need to accept that food insecurity is not only a problem that can be solved through increased food production. So they're asking us also to rethink that model. So I know that you all did this exercise as well. So the idea was that I could give you 2 cases, then you had all of these questions. So we'll talk about that in a second. But the idea is that you have 2 cases from Costa Rica, from me, of the 2 different models, and then everyone did their own research. So you're going to have a chance to talk about what you researched and compare it to the themes that we had in class. And I finished on time, so I have time for questions, comments, and to follow up on some of the things that we talked about.
So it showed that we produce enough food, but a lot of that food is industrial produce.
Yes.
So if everyone would switch into the agroecological production, would we be able to produce enough food?
There are some people that say yes, and some people that say no, and some people that say we don't have enough data. One of the things that's important to understand is that we produce enough food, and a lot of that is grain. And a lot of that food is then transitioned to animal feed. So a lot of the food we're producing that could be consumed by humans is being consumed by animals. And we lose energy in the transition in that process. So one of the things, not only about thinking about the change in the model of production, but also thinking about changes in diets. So like I said, there's a whole bunch of dimensions to food security, and I went to the roots of it, but we do also need to think about our food growing choices. What are we going to grow? What is the outcome of that? There are some interesting studies that say that they think that we could, and models that they think we could produce through the agroecological model. Here's the main challenge, and this is, I'm always gathering data on this because I'd like to make this argument. The thing is the money that goes into research and development for food security almost always goes into the industrial model. So we need to actually redirect programs, policies, and research funds to actually know if we could do this. So we've been testing, and we're spending millions and billions of dollars on new varieties of food, of a few crops, like the main crops: wheat, maize, canola, soy, and we're thinking about modifications for insect resistance or herbicide resistance or even climate adaptation. And all of that is good research. I think all research is good. It's just we're not investing the same amount in this. So we have to speculate, and I don't think that there's a level playing ground there. So I think, like I said, you can read opinions and research-based papers either way, but I don't think we have enough data. Yeah.
James is next. I saw his hand up before mine. I was just wondering, are there any studies or maybe formulas that can adjust inputs per yield? So what I'm wondering is, industrial, high yield but high input, so you cut into that yield with what you have to spend. Agroecological, sometimes we see high and dense yields for small spots, but it's more skills intensive, like the reading said. Is there any study or any academic research that's gone into adjusting that yield for inputs required and the internalization of the system?
So that's called what The question we just had is adjustments of yields. So maybe not be as wasteful in the industrial system, because often it's not only what we need, but then it's what the businesses or the farmers apply. And there's a lot of studies that also show that not only do the large industries, they might apply the amount that's suggested by the chemical company, but then small scale farmers, and this is based on Costa Rica and a few other countries that I've read the same thing about, is that then farmers often just over apply because they might have a pest problem and they're not even following the directives that you're supposed to be following. So you're over applying fertilizers and over applying pesticides, which is unhealthy for humans, for the environment, and then it's also an economic burden on that farmer. So what they've come up with in the last couple of decades is this idea called sustainable agriculture intensification. So it's interesting because we're taking a sustainable agriculture and then we're adding intensification. So that might kind of fit this middle ground that you're looking for. The problem is that, like any concept, whoever applies sustainable agriculture intensification is defining intensification and is it defining sustainable differently. We don't have a consensus on what sustainable agriculture intensification means to me or means to you. So the idea, the principles around it are really good. So it would be, first, one of the main principles of we call it SAI, is to actually draw on some of agroecology and bring that into industrial farming. However, the transition is hard, and you also have to, sometimes during a transition period, there are decreased yields and decreased profits. So that's one of the things. So thinking of where we could actually eliminate the inputs, and we could bring in agroecology. And then there's things like drip application or precise application of fertilizers and pesticides. They're using drones that are timed to do that. So coming up with different ways so we're not as wasteful. But there is a big debate on whether, if we are doing SAI, sustainable agriculture intensification, if that's just going to be, we might make some modifications, but it's just going to be an excuse to keep producing more on the industrial side of things and not rethink all of those relationships and connections that we may not be building in that model. Like whether or not from agroecology, we're just going to adopt one type of nitrogen fertilizing plant and then move on business as usual. And that's something that we're analyzing right now and seeing how that evolves.
I was just going to ask, in permaculture they talk about bartering a lot. Would that be something that would be, do you think it would be possible at a large scale, maybe amongst countries, or do you think that the money is still going to be necessary?
Well, I think always transitions. It's hard to go from one idea to the next very quickly. So I think that in a transition period, it's all about trying different techniques. I don't know of any real large-scale studies of bartering, but I do know that in agroecology, that's common, like exchanging food, sharing, going back to kind of these traditional ways. One of the challenges with seed patents and companies that have patents on seeds and resources is you're not allowed to save your own seeds and barter or share. So that part of more of a, not even industrial, more of like a capitalistic form of thinking about our food production inhibits those types of things. And we visited with some of the students that were here, one farm last semester, before the semester started, and she is part of the Organic Agriculture Board, and she's an agroecologist, so those are different things. But she was saying that there's some new laws that she's aware of in Costa Rica that may be passed that may inhibit the trade and exchange of all seeds. However, that's not necessarily going to be passed, but there's discussion of that. So I think bartering is a good thing. I think it's an economic safety net. I think it's a cultural security. It promotes cultural sharing, but I'm not sure of the scale of that yet. Yeah.
Just briefly, were a lot of these naturally occurring, or did someone actually have to come in and plant them? Or
the bananas or the pictures I have in the bottom?
The different.
All are naturally occurring there. Yeah, and the bananas were brought in earlier, like back in the 1400s, and then there's about, in this territory, there's about 10 species of banana. But the banana's not native to the Americas, but all those other plants are. Yeah. We'll just go here and then come back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Can you? The question I feel that you've already answered partially, but I fear that this question will be asked to me during the facilitation sessions. I would rather the answer come from you rather than from me.
Thank you.
It's a very commonplace understanding or possibly propaganda which is put out that the growing economies of the world with growing populations and so on and so forth cannot be fed without the industrial mode of production. And you've already partially touched upon how that might be that is a false excuse. But if you could expand further for our benefit, that would be really great.
Great. So it is a common narrative that we need the industrial form of production to feed the world. And so I think that's what a lot of researchers on more the agroecological side, or even the SAI, Sustainable Agriculture Intensification side, are trying to come up with. And so, as I said, I've read 2 good studies that say that agroecological methods could feed the world, 2 good ones. But what I answered, is it Verna? Irma, yeah, right. What I answered Irma is that one of the main, I would say, constraints is that we just don't have enough R&D funding to go into creating the models and creating that knowledge. But if we start teasing out how many calories we have produced in the past years, we have always been producing enough to feed the world. Even during the greatest famines in the world, this was like Amartya Sen, one of his main contributions were great famines. He came and said it was never because we didn't produce enough food. It was because the food was in the hands of an elite few, and those that needed the food couldn't access it. It's the same thing today. And so that's where the FAO, in their report, they're kind of hesitant to produce really definitive data to say that. They use language like probable and possible and things like this, but they do say that we need to think of a different model that's not only focused on production, because access is clearly an issue. Because if we are producing enough calories, like even cereals alone, 2017, just cereals, the calories from cereals and proteins from cereals was enough to feed our 2017 population. That didn't account for all the wild foods, all of the meat that we're harvesting or farming. It didn't account for any of that. So we were way above the amount of calories. It's just that we still have 1 in 9 people in the world are undernourished, and then that statistic gets even worse when we separate by gender, race, ethnicity, etc. So we have a real serious access issue. But I don't have a definitive study. I'm still searching, but I think that can be a motivator for you PSERs to get together and produce a report on that.
I'm wondering what the climate models suggest in terms of Costa Rica change in precipitation temperature, and whether or not that will have an effect on pineapple and other larger crops that are grown here, coffee. Yeah. Things like that. Yeah, so climate models and main staple or export crops, I'd say export crops in Costa Rica, like coffee, pineapple, banana. So I do lots of agroecology, so I wouldn't say I have all of the latest science. But what I have read, so I'm just putting that disclaimer out. But for coffee, we have the main data is also on increasing temperatures and pests, so the increase of pests. So we have a pest for bananas that's traveling down to Florida, and that's supposed to hit Central and South America, and this is increased in numbers due to climate change. And so I have a friend working in the National Genetic Institute for Bananas, and she's working like crazy to find a new variety of bananas, because basically the prediction is that they'll be totally wiped out. Not directly related to weather and lack of water, but because of this increase in pest infestation of the bananas. Coffee is a similar situation. Coffee, we've actually had to start changing the altitude of growth of the main coffee variety that's grown in the Central Valley due to the changes in climate. So there are, I think, shifts in the species that we're going to have to use. If we change elevation of coffee and we keep going up because it needs a cooler climate, we can't go up that far because we don't have that many mountains in Costa Rica. So we have to think that through. So there are definite climate implications, and those are the 2 main ones that I know of.
On the pineapples case, Bromethil has been banned, but how is the supervision that actually companies are no longer using it?
Yeah, so we've banned the use, the import, the production, in 2015. And so I think that I don't know the supervision specifically of Bromacil, but I think the supervision is going to be similar to other things in the rest of the country. It's almost absent. So we have the Toxicological Institute at the National University that are doing such great work because they were able to prove and demonstrate like that 8 times higher in the water of having Bromacil in the water than is permitted in the USA, for instance. So they're doing a lot of monitoring, which is excellent. But nationally, there's a lack of resources. So there's a lack of resources and personnel to put that into practice. And not even the monitoring part, but even the cases. So I think that from that master's thesis that I read on pineapple, there was one year where there's 44 cases that weren't even dealt with in the courts due to claims that the companies were using toxic chemicals and that was affecting lands, water, natural areas, and they just didn't have enough personnel to deal with those cases. So I don't think the monitoring is sufficient for those things, but the nice thing is we won't be importing that. We actually did have a shipment. I read a news piece that there was a large shipment of Bromacil from China just recently, and so it's at customs right now. So they're reviewing it, and I think they are going to send it back. So they tried to send some, and at least there's monitoring at that level.
All right, I have a question.
I'm
in the back.
Oh, hi.
I have a statement that hopefully will turn into a question. So the group of indigenous people you're using as an example live in a tropical area, therefore their climate issues change, but overall they're in a climate that allows for a lot of growth. However, like the Inuit who traditionally don't grow anything, I guess there are some indigenous people that kind of get left out in this thought that indigenous ways can be useful only because of our climate issues. Like as an indigenous person from the northeast of the United States, we only have a short period of time to do anything. Yeah. And that's why like the three sisters, like corn, bean, and squash, those are our staples because in the summer we know we can do those. Like we have holidays to celebrate different vegetables because now that the climate has changed, we're not even necessarily going to be granted that type of harvest. So where do you see these people in regards to climate as actively being a part of this debate from an indigenous perspective, like trying to change the industrial ways, even though even where we are is limited?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the answer could be quite complex, but let me try and address some of the points that you were saying, so thank you for mentioning it. I think it depends culturally and geographically as well. Like you said, the Bribri people in this more with arable land and with high productivity and fertility, they all are facing climate issues, lots of pests, lots of changes in pests. And I showed you a really nice agroecological picture, but if you go back to the map, and there was, I'll go back so we can look at it. Here we go. Where the town is Bribri. So if you go just Bribri to Bahoquen, half of that distance or more is all industrial banana plantations. So that's spilling over. And actually, I was just there last month in Bahoquen, just the town over all has those blue plastic bags around the bananas, so which are laden with pesticides as well as deterrent for animals. They're like encroaching on that area. So that's one thing. And that type of industrial farming upsets kind of the complexity and the relationships that we are able to use for biological control and other things. So they're experiencing, not only due to climate changes, because it's getting quite a lot hotter there, they're experiencing like the changes from industrial farming that they're having to adapt to. So I wouldn't leave them out of that conversation. But like you said, if you go to Inuit and you go to Northern Canada, for instance, or US, for different groups, there's a lot of things happening. And one thing that is happening is in some of those northern areas, you've got increased growing seasons. So there's greenhouses popping up, and maybe not traditional vegetables, but there'll be different vegetables that people are growing. And in the north, that's been important because I don't know if anybody's familiar, but when you're in remote areas, especially places where you need to fly in food supplies, like the cost of food for northern communities and specifically Indigenous communities in Canada is atrocious. Like a liter of milk is like $12 instead of $2. So these are high prices. And the Food Security Survey of Canada illustrated that Indigenous people are, and this is minimal, it's probably more, twice as likely to be food insecure than non-Indigenous Canadians. So I think it would depend on the context. I think to answer your question, from my perspective, I think we're entering into the conversation with human rights. So there's like UN DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then we're bringing in the other human rights, like cultural, social, and economic rights, the human right to food, the human right to adequate food, and adequate means culturally appropriate. So those human rights are tools for Indigenous peoples to open the conversation at the local level, but also at international level, and to start talking about food security and food sovereignty and defining their own food security. Now, do all people have access to that? No. In Canada, we have many great initiatives, partnerships with universities, partnerships like Indigenous communities in the South partnering with Indigenous communities in the North, and we have a space in government and in private and public institutions to talk about that, to have forums on food security, whereas other countries, we wouldn't have that. I think some places may lose some of their biodiversity, as you said. We may see changes in growing seasons, but there also are a lot of ways of adapting. Even adapting could be adopting new forms of new species to eat, but growing them in traditional ways and continuing to share the food in traditional ways and continue to have sharing circles and hunting and trapping trips. So you see that a lot in Canada, where Indigenous people may not be able to harvest the large sea mammals anymore because of toxicology studies, where heavy metals bioaccumulate in the fat of animals. So whales and seals are actually have high quantity of heavy metals. So that's the traditional diet of many northern Indigenous communities. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they'll just kind of get wiped out from the food security conversation, because if you have a different species that you're eating, you can also harvest it. You will lose some of the knowledges around hunting, but you can still travel out in the land. You can still share knowledge from grandmother to granddaughter, for instance, around cooking and preparation. But I think it's a good point, and personally the way I approach that point is often from a human rights conversation, because instead of kind of marginalizing it, puts it at the forefront that everyone has a right to food and also a right to cultural food.
I just have a quick follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think if Indigenous peoples were able to kind of patent Indigenous things such as blue maize or red maize, do you think that that would do justice on the industrial level in terms of kind of creating more or less of equal market?
Yeah, I think
like Monsanto and.
Yeah, I don't know about patent. I think every community or band government would have to determine how they want to deal with intellectual property rights. But I think if we would recognize globally intellectual property rights around foods and knowledges about food, like we have so many in Costa Rica, so many fancy coffee shops creating this chocolate in an Indigenous way, but like where they're buying it from, they're getting paid such a low price. And people even in San Jose are learning to produce the chocolate in an Indigenous way and selling it based on that accumulative cultural knowledge. So I definitely think we need to redress the inequalities around intellectual properties.
You told us a little bit about the fact that in the north of Costa Rica, the workers in the counties that had pineapple didn't really increase their profits. Can you tell us a little bit about the workers' life? I mean, what do they do in these plantations, and why is it so? I mean, why didn't they increase given the Costa Rica pineapple is around the world now?
Yeah, so I think I don't work on a pineapple plantation, but I'll give you the knowledge that I have just from talking with people, experts that have worked in this area. And I think plantation to plantation, it'll be different, right? Depends on the scale and the size. But for instance, people producing pineapple for Nexo, which was a company in the north of Costa Rica, we could say the wage that I've read from that INCAI report is 400, the wage of the pineapple plantation workers full-time would be $450 per month. So the report in INCAI said that was actually positive, because that's pretty high in terms of non-trained agricultural workers. So like we have categories in Costa Rica for minimum wages. Alonso would know, but just to tell the rest. So they said that that's high on the level of other agricultural workers in that same scenario, but $450 is not a lot. So I think that that's one of the reasons why some of those indices didn't go up. But in the development index, there's other factors like infrastructure, like education, like social programs. And I think that these areas are invisible, and a lot of people that write about these issues talk about the social invisibility behind the production of these types of industrial crops. So I don't think that with the state has definitely highly promoted the export of non-traditional, that's what we call pineapple because it's not a traditional fruit here, non-traditional agricultural exports. But I don't think that they've done the work to go and, or the companies haven't done the work, or the state hasn't required the companies to do so to increase all those other sectors of social well-being. I think that's why. Yeah.
I was wondering how, if you think genetically modified plants fit into the agricultural model, if they do, or if it's like a totally separate industrial model.
What do you think?
I mean, all plants I think are genetically modified in some way, but like where they are now, where like Monsanto is working to like speed that along.
Yeah. So genetically modified plants, or everyone uses GM because that's what we know, but the correct term that they're trying to promote now is genetically engineered plants, because it's defined as a plant where a gene from a plant and or other organism a foreign gene has been inserted into the genome of a plant. Okay, so that would be a GM or a GE crop. And there is a lot of talk about, well, it's a highly debated topic. I think that, well, to start, the industrial model, or even that SAI, Sustainable Agricultural Intensification, proponents of that model have widely accepted these genetically modified crops, and proponents of the agroecological model have not. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the whole world, but in general, that's where it lies. And so I think if you think about the reasons why we're producing these GM crops is to get high yields, to have less, maybe more efficient, to grow fast, and to get high yields. And maybe to be resistant to things, like resistant, so I'll give you an example. And we also have to think of each one of these differently. There's one type of genetically modified crop which is resistant to herbicide, that actually Roundup, that glyphosate. Monsanto created soy, created maize, is working on wheat, has some wheat, still working on it, alfalfa, canola, that has a gene inside of it that makes it resistant to their chemical. So what that does is you can grow a lot of, let's say, soy, this genetically engineered soy, you can grow a lot of it, and then instead of worrying about weeding and using humans to take the weeds out or machines to take the weeds out, you just spray a whole bunch of chemicals and everything else dies. So it's just an efficient way. You can actually get a machine to do it. You reduce your labor, you reduce your costs. So that form of genetically modified plant fits into the agro-industrial model. There's lots of issues and problems with it. One of the things that I'll mention is just that we're seeing, and a book just came out last year, we're seeing resistant plants to Roundup or glyphosate. So it was a quick solution, a lot of money. So it's the way I think about it. If all the money that went in to develop genetically modified strains of a few crops went into thinking about how to expand agroecology and scale that up, I don't know what the world would look like right now. I think it would look a little better. But so much money has gone into genetically modified because you need trials and trials in labs, then you need trials and trials in the field, then you need to work on policies, and you need to have these huge discussions and debates, and there's a lot of money. And now, and it's only been it's been a very short period of time, like since the late 1900s, early 2000s, that we've started to release these. We have all these weeds popping up that are resistant. So it's like in 20 years, we're going to have to start modifying again because that didn't work. So I don't know if the answer is it fits in the industrial model, but I'm giving you some of the kind of negative consequences that I think we should have redirected resources. So I think, do we have another question? I don't want to go over time. Do we have another question? Maybe just last question, and then you can go for your break.
I just wanted to compliment when you're talking about how much money the people who are in northern region of Costa Rica and southern region of Costa Rica where pineapple is produced are earning about $450 US a month.
Yeah.
I just wanted to compliment also on what that money can really buy, you know.
Exactly.
Because Costa Rica is a very expensive country. If you mention 450 US dollars in another developing country, it might buy a lot of things. I just wanted to compliment you.
Exactly, thank you. And we can also remember that when people are working on farms and maybe have sold their land or using their land for intensive agriculture, they may be earning $450, but then they've lost a means for other food procurement. Because if we convert to an agricultural worker, or if we devote our lands to industrial agriculture, then we may not be growing those other what we call like safety net crops. And so we have to purchase all our food. And then we're kind of a robot within this system. When food prices go up nationally, which Costa Rica is expensive, and then we've seen food crises and we'll see them into the future. If rice goes up, then I just have to buy rice because I'm not growing rice at home anymore. Yeah. So I'll leave you with the questions that everyone did this kind of research exercise. And so I hope that this morning has been giving you kind of a wider panorama. It's much more complicated than I presented, but it's kind of food for thought for you to start thinking and start discussing, and I hope that it also creates more questions that we'll talk about throughout this year at UPeace. Thank you.